Hello everybody, welcome back. I drew a picture of you just now. That's you getting super swole. And if you zoom in, you can see this is also you passing step 1. Friendly reminder that you can do it. In our first question, we have a 34-year-old woman who presents to the clinic with a 3-week history of fatigue, weight loss, and non-productive cough. She mentions recently renovating an old barn on her property. Physical exam reveals mild hepatosplenomegaly, and a chest CT shows multiple small lung nodules and highly lymphadenopathy. Bronchoalveolar lavage is performed, and the specimen reveals numerous oval yeast forms inside of macrophages. Which of the following environmental exposures is most likely related to your condition? All right, so these are the restated bare bones facts. We have a woman with fatigue, weight loss, cough, hepatosplenomegaly. She's showing lung nodules, highly lymphadenopathy. Those are the highlight points right there. And we have a lot of choices, but we have to know what the diagnosis is. And this is histoplasmosis. This is a dimorphic fungus, and it's found in bat and bird droppings. And so renovating old barns disturbs contaminated dust, and that releases spores into the air. And the intracellular oval yeast inside the macrophages and the pulmonary symptoms with highly adenopathy are diagnostic. All right, why is it not something else like desert hiking? Well, that'd be coccidioides immitis. That's the southwest US. That's the valley fever. So it's the wrong geography and the wrong organism. Working with mosquito-infested water, that'd be the West Nile virus or malaria, not fungal infections. There's no vector-based transmission here. Regular exposure to decaying vegetable matter and compost piles. So that would be aspergillus and the immunocompromised. Does not explain the macrophage internal yeast or the histo exposure. Gardening and sustaining minor cuts from the plant thorns is sporothrix. That's the rose gardener's disease. All right, so you have the subacute pulmonary symptoms like cough, fatigue, weight loss, and the exposure to the bat and the bird droppings in the caves, the barns, the attics. And on histology, you have the oval yeast inside of the macrophages in Ohio and Mississippi River Valley. And this can cause a disseminated disease in the immunocompromised, like the hepatosplenomegaly. And so what happens is you inhale the spores convert to yeast and form in the lungs. The yeast are phagocytosed by alveolar macrophages, and the organism survives intracellularly, and it spreads via the reticuloendothelial system, and that causes granulomatous inflammation and mimics TB and sarcoidosis. All right, so really watch out for the Ohio and Mississippi river valleys and the farms, spelunking people, and old buildings and barns. All right, renovating old barns with bad exposure is linked to pulmonary histoplasmosis indicated by yeast forms in the macrophages. There you go, folks. Here, a 72-year-old man presents to the clinic with difficulty urinating and frequent need to urinate. Over the past several months, he reports waking up multiple times at night to urinate and straining during urination. His medical history includes controlled hypertension, and dyslipidemia is characterized by abnormal levels of lipids in their bloodstream. So like cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL, which is like the good cholesterol, things like that. Sometimes you can have the yellow deposits in the skin, in the eyes, pain, the cramping in the legs, that kind of stuff. And you analyze that through a lipid panel. But anyways, he denies any dysuria and hematuria and physical examination, and the abdomen is soft and non-tender. But a digital rectal examination reveals an enlarged non-tender prostate. A post-void residual urine volume is measured at 150. Which of the following, oh my gosh, is the patient's condition? This is definitely going to be benign prostatic hyperplasia. So he's got nocturia, straining, and weak stream combined with the enlarged non-tender prostate and a high post-voidal residual that's classic for BPH. The absence of the dysuria and the hematuria, along with a normal DRE, which means there's no nodules on induration, makes the malignancy of infection less likely. And induration is just the hardening of the tissue. Okay, here's a brief explanation that this answer has. The classic lower urinary tract symptoms, nocturia, hesitancy, straining, increased PVR is BPH. All right, let's look at these urethral stricture stuff. So that's often seen in younger men post-injury or infection. It's less common in the prostatic cancer. So this case has smooth, non-tender enlargement, so it's BPH. What about bladder cancer? Painless hematuria is how that would present, not LUTS, right? Not that stuff. And then UTI would be dysuria, urgency, and fever, and leukocytosis. So I wrote down these things that stood out to me when I was answering this question. And he's like an older dude waking up many times in the night, straining during urination. He feels like he hasn't emptied his bladder because he hasn't. He still has 150 milliliters in there. All this points to an obstruction from prostatic tissue growth, especially DHT-driven hyperplasia of the transitional zone. So the bottom line, enlarged prostate in older men is probably BPH. All right, so here we have a 60-year-old woman with type 2 diabetes. She reports adhering to her medication regimen and diet plan. She's been monitoring her fasting blood glucose at home. And it's consistently around 90 mg per DL. During the visit, she asked how her body regulates blood glucose during the fasting periods. Which of the following types of receptors in the liver cells is primarily involved in maintaining her stable fasting levels? So we know that this is glucagon associated. And glucagon maintains this via hepatocyte G protein coupled receptors, the GS pathway, activating the CAMP to the PKA to the glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Insulin uses tyrosine kinase, while ligand-gated and toll-like receptors are related to glucose regulation. So whenever you're fasting, glucagon is the main hormone, and glucagon acts on hepatocyte G protein coupled receptors to increase the CAMP, cyclic AMP, and that drives glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, uses the RTKs, which is the receptor tyrosine kinases, and then cortisol uses the intracellular receptors, which are slow stress responders. But the primary immediate fasting signal is glucagon via G protein coupled receptors. All right, so why is it not the ligand gated ion channel? That'd be nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, or like GABA. Why is it not receptor tyrosine kinase? Well, that's insulin. That's the fed state. What about intracellular hormone receptor? That's steroids. And toll-like receptor would be pattern recognition receptor in the innate immunity system, not involved in glucose stuff. So when you fast, your blood sugar is stable, and that's because of your liver. The hormone in charge is glucagon, which rises as the insulin drops. And so glucagon doesn't use an insulin-like receptor. Instead, it binds to the G protein coupled receptor on your liver, triggering CAMP, activating pKa, and it turns on the enzymes that break down glycogen, and it makes new glucose. And so that's how your liver keeps your glucose at 90 even when you haven't eaten in a while. Kind of cool. So the bottom line is G protein coupled receptors in the liver regulate glucose homeostasis during fasting. In our next question, a 65-year-old woman with a non-small cell lung cancer has just started treatment via carboplatin and paclitaxel. A week after her first infusion, she visits the emergency department complaining of severe fatigue and persistent diarrhea. On physical examination, she is noted to have thinning hair and pale conjunctiva. Her complete blood count shows leukopenia, anemia, and thrombocytopenia. Which of the following tissues is most likely affected in this patient due to chemotherapy regimen? Okay, so cytotoxic chemotherapy is what this question is about, and that targets the rapidly dividing cells. I had another question about this, I think like 2 months ago, like 500 videos ago. And that includes not only the tumors, but also the normal tissues with high turnover. And so the way they test this on step 1, they're like, oh, it's the bone marrow, because that's the blood cells. It's the GI mucosa, because that's the lining of the gut, and those need to be replaced. And the hair follicles, right? Those are particularly vulnerable, and that causes pancytopenia, diarrhea, and alopecia, exactly what this patient's suffering from. And so it's gut mucosa, bone marrow, and hair follicles. All right, so why is it not heart muscles and liver and kidneys? Well, cardiotoxicity would be doxorubicin, and nephrohepatotoxicity comes from other drugs, salivary glands. Those don't have high turnover. Neither does cartilage and tendons. That's low turnover, the connective tissues. And skin epithelium and lymph nodes in the spleen. The skin can have mild changes, but the main effect is in the GI and also the bone marrow and the hair follicles. So lymph nodes and spleen are not typically destroyed except in like radiation or immune suppression. So chemotherapy drugs like carboplatin, paclitaxel, they destroy the cancer drugs, but they also like target all rapidly dividing cells. And so week after treatment, you could have pancytopenia, mucocytosis with diarrhea, and hair loss. So chemotherapy with these guys affects the rapidly dividing cells in the gut, bone marrow, and hair follicles. If you want to see more on this, then watch my video on Homer Simpson. It's kind of fun. Also, be sure to like and subscribe if you're liking this stuff. I did it for you. All right, here we have a 48-year-old farmer presented to the clinic with a week-long history of fever, chills, and a painful ulcer on his right arm. He reports that the ulcer developed after he scratched his arm with a thorn while tending to his rose bushes. Sounds like my grandpa. On examination, there is a 2-centimeter ulcer in the forearm with erythematous base, eschar in the center. By the way, that's the dry, dark, scabby stuff that falls away on the dead skin. It's caused by like a burn or a bite of a mite or anthrax infection. And he also has tender regional lymphadenopathy. Lab tests are ordered for further evaluation, and a polymerase chain reaction test is used to identify a specific gene involved in the synthesis of lipopolysaccharide component lipid A. Which of the following organisms is most likely responsible for this patient's condition? So let's break them down. Bacillus anthracis. Well, that one does have the buzzword of the eschar, but it's wrong because it's usually from animal hides, not rose thorns, and so that's not the answer. How about Borrelia? Well, no, because that's a tick bite in erythema migrans, so that's going to be Lyme disease that starts with a target rash, not an ulcer or anything like that. And Francisella is the right answer. Pseudomonas, that would be burns in a hot tub folliculitis. That rarely causes eschar or painful ulcers. It's normally nosocomial infections. They are opportunistic. And Streptococcus pyogenes would cause cellulitis and necrotizing fasciitis. And that's a gram-positive cocci, no lipid A or ulcer formation. It's more diffuse soft tissue environment. All right, so this is indeed going to be C. And the interesting thing here is that just one bacterium of Francisella tularensis can make you sick. All right, super, super infectious bacteria. It's one of the most infectious ones known to man. So we got this farmer, thorn scratch, and then he's got an ulcer with tender lymph nodes. And so it's going to be an ulceroglandular type. So it's a tiny gram-negative coccobacillus, and it just sneaks into your skin through little cuts or punctures, and it causes local necrosis with a central black spot. And that lipid A gene that's mentioned in the PCR is the giveaway, right? That's the gram-negative organism with endotoxin activity. All right, then the Bacillus anthracis, that's going to be a painless eschar, usually from the animal hides. But Borrelia is like a target rash, right? So the thorn, ulcer, lymphadenopathy, and lipid A means that it's Francisella tularensis. So ulcer with eschar and lymphadenopathy in a farmer suggests cutaneous tularemia from Francisella tularensis. There you go. Here we have a 32-year-old woman presenting to the clinic with a 3-week history of increased fatigue and easy bruising. She reports occasional joint pain and swelling in her fingers and wrists, and she also notes that her face tends to redden when she Spends time in the sun. Review of symptoms reveals no other symptoms. Physical examination shows petechiae over the lower extremities. That's the smaller red-purple spots caused by bleeding in the skin. And the lab tests reveal a positive antinuclear antibody, ANA, and also anti-Smith antibody. So which laboratory findings is most likely associated with this patient's condition? The answer is thrombocytopenia. And the reason why, she's got lupus. So she's got the immune thrombocytopenia because of the autoantibody-mediated destruction of the blood cells, type 2 hypersensitivity stuff. All right, so we know this because of the photosensitive rash, arthralgia, fatigue, bruising, and this is confirmed by the positive ANA and anti-Smith antibodies. And the presence of and bruising points to an immune-mediated thrombocytopenia, which is a common hematological manifestation of lupus. So the platelets are destroyed by the antiplatelet antibodies, similar to the idiopathic thrombocytopenia purpura. Let's look at the other answers and why they're wrong. Elevated reticulocyte count. All right, so the buzzword there is hemolytic anemia. And that's wrong because the reticulocyte count may be elevated only if hemolysis is occurring. And this patient's primary issue is platelet loss, not necessarily the red blood cell destruction. And so that's why A is not right. How about B? Hypereosinophilia. Well, the buzzword there is going to be allergic reactions and parasitic infections and neoplasms. So there's no sign of eosinophil-driven disease or allergy, so that's why it's not the right answer. How about the smudge cells, the CLL? Well, that's wrong because it's seen in older adults and it's not related to autoimmune conditions like lupus, which it clearly has. And thrombocytosis is the opposite of what lupus does. Instead, lupus typically causes the low platelets, right? Because in SLE, the problem is platelet destruction, not overproduction. All right, so up to 50% of patients with lupus develop some sort of a blood cell deficiency. So lupus isn't just like the rashes and the joint pain, it also kills the blood cells. All right, so the patient's got fatigue, joint swelling, bruising, photosensitivity, positive ANA, all the anti-Smith stuff, like she just clearly has lupus. Malar butterfly rash, like how could they have made it more simple? But they made it tricky with the petechiae, the tiny red spots that are caused by the low platelets. And so in lupus, the immune system creates auto antibodies against the platelets and it leads to their destruction. And that's why the lab findings here is thrombocytopenia. Okay, so the bottom line is the positive anti-Smith antibodies indicate systemic lupus, commonly associated with thrombocytopenia. There you go. All right, let's talk about glucocorticoids. So a 52-year-old woman with a history of autoimmune hepatitis is being treated with corticosteroids. And corticosteroids is just any type of steroid hormone that is produced in the adrenal cortex or made synthetically. And there are two kinds, glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. And they have various metabolic functions, and they're used to treat inflammation. All right, so she is being treated with corticosteroids. And despite resolution of her symptoms and a decrease in circulating levels of the medication, the therapeutic effects persist beyond the expected duration, which are the following characteristics of glucocorticoid, right? Like hydrocortisone is an example of that. There's involved in the metabolism of carbohydrates and proteins and fats and have anti-inflammatory activity, right? So the glucocorticoid receptor is most likely responsible for the prolonged effect of the medication. Does it activate receptor tyrosine kinases? Well, that'd be like growth factor receptors like insulin or EGFR. That's wrong because glucocorticoids are not tyrosine kinase receptors. How about B? Competes for binding site with the heat shock proteins. Well, these guys are displaced whenever the steroid binds. And it's wrong because it's not responsible for the prolonged effect. It's just one of the steps, right? C, directly increases cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or the CAMP, concentrations. That'd be a GS protein coupled receptors, like beta-2 agonists. And that's wrong because steroids don't act through the second trimestrin systems. Stimulates prolonged gene transcription. Bingo, bingo. Corticosteroids act on the intracellular receptors, not membrane-bound ones. These receptors translocate into the nucleus and regulate gene expression because protein synthesis and downstream cellular responses are going to take time to reverse. That means the therapeutic effects are going to be persistent long after the drug levels are declining. All right, and then what about E? Triggers acute release of intracellular calcium storage. That's the GQ pathway, all right? And the GQ, I've made a couple of videos about this, maybe 400 videos back. That's seen in like the IP3 and DAG systems. And that's wrong because steroids do not trigger rapid calcium-based responses. All right, so glucocorticoids, they work long after they leave the bloodstream. And here is the explanation. They change what your cells actually make. All right, so when glucocorticoids enter the cell, they bind to the cytoplasmic receptor. And then they kick off some of the heat shock proteins, and then they march into the nucleus. And then they rewire the gene expression and they turn off pro-inflammatory genes and they turn on the protective ones. So it's kind of crazy. They just go and storm the Capitol. It's kind of insane. Okay, so they stimulate prolonged gene transcription and lead to extended therapeutic effects despite decreased circulating levels. All right, what about this new view? It's kind of funny, right? All right, so somebody is brought to the clinic because of the eating habits. The roommate mentions that the patient often eats large amounts of food in a short period, then isolates herself in the bathroom, basically purges, and she has mild dental erosion. And which of the following is most likely present in this patient? The answer is hypochloremia. Now, this is an interesting one, right? So we know what this is. I actually can't say it on YouTube or else I will get blocked, but you know what it is. You can read it. Here is the explanation description. Basically, it's the repeated vomiting that causes the loss of the gastric acid, right? So you lose that HCl and that results in hypochloremic condition. That's hypokalemic metabolic acidosis. And the hypochloremia is the hallmark laboratory clue here. Hyperkalemia would be the opposite, and hyponatremia and hypercalcemia and hyperphosphatemia are not typical here. Okay, so basically this is like an acid draining problem. Every purge is like a dumping hydrochloric acid out of the body. And as you do that, you'll have the dental erosion, the calloused knuckles, and it's just such a sad syndrome. Truly is. It actually just breaks my heart when I talk about this. But every episode of the vomiting, you lose the hydronium and the chloride ions, and this creates a hypochloremic metabolic alkalosis environment, and in aldosterone activation, and potassium levels also drop. So hypochloremia, hypokalemia are the go-to answers. Okay, so there's the bottom line. The recurrent vomiting and electrolyte imbalances. Very real condition, very stigmatized, a lot more work to be done in that area. All right, here we have a 67-year-old man with a history of stable angina. He's admitted to the hospital for evaluation of chest pain that occurs with moderate exertion. He is currently taking aspirin and has become recently prescribed a new medication. During hospital stay, he reports episodes of wheezing and difficulty breathing. On examination, he has prolonged expiration and wheezing. A pulmonary function test shows decreased FEV1 to FVC ratio, which improves significantly after administration of an inhaled beta agonist. The new medication is suspected to have triggered his respiratory symptoms. Which of the following medications is most likely responsible for his wheezing? All right, this is Carvedilol, but we need to talk about why. So Carvedilol is a non-selective beta blocker. And that means it inhibits both beta-1 and beta-2 receptors. And so blocking beta-2 receptors in the lungs prevents normal bronchodilation, and that can potentially trigger a bronchospasm, especially in people with asthma or reactive airway disease. And so that reversible drop in the FEV1 confirms the asthma-like physiology and that makes Carvedilol the most likely choice. What about other things like atenolol? Well, that one is a beta-1 selective drug, right? So the minimal effect on the lungs. Lisinopril is going to be an ACE inhibitor, so that can cause cough, but not wheezing and bronchospasms. Hydrochlorothiazide, that is not associated with bronchospasms. It may cause metabolic changes like hypokalemia, but nothing like that. Diltiazem is a non-dihydropyridine CCB, and that's wrong because it affects the heart rate and conduction, not the bronchioles. So the asthma suddenly becoming worse if you start a new medication, then you should check if it's a beta blocker because he's treated for angina, but now he's wheezing and his spirometry shows reversible airway obstruction, so he's got like the asthma stuff. And that's because Carvedilol is a non-selective beta blocker and it's great for the heart, but it blocks B2, beta-2 in the lungs, stopping bronchodilation and triggering bronchospasm. And you probably heard of that like A through M rule for the beta-1 selective stuff, the general kind of stuff, beta-1 selective. It's like atenolol, metoprolol, esmolol, bisoprolol, that kind of stuff. There are some exceptions though, like Carvedilol and labetalol, because those start with A to M, but they're mixed alpha-1, beta-1, beta-2 blockers. And Carvedilol and labetalol both block beta-1 and beta-2 and alpha-1, and that causes bronchospasms. So even though it starts with C, it's not necessarily beta-1 selective. And so you should think of beaming the heart. Bisoprolol, esmolol, atenolol, acebutolol, and metoprolol. Okay, those are the go-to drugs for hypertension, post-MI, heart failure, and Carvedilol and labetalol are non-selective with alpha blockade. All right, this next question, we have a 23-year-old female college student presenting to the emergency department with a right lower quadrant abdominal pain. It began 12 hours ago. She says it's sharp and constant. She's experienced nausea but no vomiting. Her last menstrual period was 10 days ago, and she reports a regular cycle. She is sexually active with one partner and uses condoms consistently. Her temperature is 100.9. Blood pressure is 118/74, and heart rate is 92 per minute. Physical examination reveals tenderness of the right lower quadrant and pain upon cervical motion. Pelvic examination demonstrates mucopurulent cervical discharge, and a urine pregnancy test is negative. Which of the following is the most likely diagnosis? All right, so the big conditions here are lower abdominal pain, cervical motion tenderness, mucopurulent discharge, and a fever. And she's sexually active with an STI risk, and negative pregnancy test rules out ectopic pregnancy, so that's why A is wrong. Acute appendicitis would be right lower quadrant pain and also some of the rebound there. There's no CMT or cervical discharge in appendicitis, and this patient has gynecologic signs, so that's the reason why it's not right. Pyelonephritis would have flank pain, CVA tenderness, urinary symptoms, but it's wrong because there's no urinary symptoms or CVA tenderness. And it's not endometriosis because that have chronic pelvic pain, dysmenorrhea, and dyspareunia, but this is acute, not chronic, and there's no cyclical pattern there, right? And fever, so it's pelvic inflammatory. She's got right lower quadrant pain, fever, mucopurulent discharge, and pain on the motion. So the pain, discharge, and the tenderness is going to tell you it's pelvic inflammatory disease, not ectopic pregnancy because you took the test. And so the bottom line here is that pelvic inflammatory disease is likely due to the right lower quadrant pain, fever, and cervical motion tenderness with mucopurulent discharge. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking and subscribing. Let me know what I should cover next, and we'll see you guys in the next video.